Well, Alison, Ms. McDonald, thank you very much for joining me today. Great to be out here. We're in Larose Forest, which is it's on a staggeringly beautiful sunny day as well, so cannot complain about that in the slightest. But we're here to talk about the recent press conferences by South Nation Conservation, looking at the NHS. For me, NHS is a very different thing where I come from, so if you could just break us down what the NHS is and what it consists of.
Okay, so NHS is obviously an acronym. It stands for Natural Heritage System. And a natural heritage system is really just a recognition of how things actually exist in nature on the ground. So it's recognizing that things don't exist in little concrete patches or areas, that everything is actually connected to one another. And I think an easy way to think about connections is often rivers and creeks and streams, valleys, things like that. But in nature, it's almost like the highways of nature. So we're looking for county level road connections for wildlife and how wildlife might move from somewhere like Larose Forest out to the Alfred Bog. So the natural heritage system is all these important natural spaces and how they're connected on the landscape for animals to move.
And could you, speaking of those natural spaces, you have a certain number of categories. What number? They're called different things, aren't they? Could you take us through what those natural spaces are called?
Yeah, so we have within our natural core areas, we have things like woodlands, wetlands, areas of natural scientific interest. Basically all of these features people may have heard of before, water courses, floodplains, all of that can be our natural core area. But generally in our area, the big natural cores end up being woodlands and wetlands.
Okay.
So a lot of the Dickinson's Creek, Hammond Swamp, that would be in Clarence Rockland, and then Alfred Bog. They're all made up of treed swamps or wetlands, large areas that haven't been developed, full of natural cover. These natural cores are also often publicly owned. So for example, Larose Forest is owned by the United Counties of Prescott and Russell. And another one down in Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry would be Warwick Forest, owned by the counties. And then the other component is the natural linkages, the natural corridors. And those run between the cores. Often those are forested, but sometimes there's agricultural land as well.
So looking at the recent study, it was really looking into these natural linkages areas as well, wasn't it? Because these core natural areas are quite easy to identify. We're sat in one at the moment. It's those obvious, evident places on a map, but the linkages is something that's a little bit more, or has been a little bit more subjective. So was this natural heritage study, was it the first of its kind? And what did it encompass?
So both counties previously had corridors on their mapping being the official plans. This is where this will live, even though it is much bigger than just a planning exercise. But previously it had been done sort of visually at a very sort of high level. We called it more of a basic system. What the study is actually using a landscape analysis to better define those corridors and spending more time with experts, people like ecologists, farmers, people who work in aggregates, to refine and scope them better. For example, one of the corridors that existed previously was very, very, very large and wide, and it went through the entire village of Embrun.
Okay, yes.
And often when we would see some commercial development or applications coming in for new development, we'd say, oh, it's within the corridor. And we'd say, well, I don't think we're going to see too many moose making their way down Notre Dame Street in Embrun. This is something where we need a refinement. It makes sense because of where Embrun is between two natural cores, but the corridor needed to be shifted and refined. So we consider it a bit of a refinement, a bit of an update. And what we've done, the corridor still needs to pass through Embrun, but we've brought the corridor in so it follows the river valley of the Castor very nicely. And again, we've really tried to avoid urban areas, areas where development is prioritized by a municipality. And so I think it's an improvement, but it's also more based on scientific analysis and expert review.
And this refinement, why would you say it's so important? And on top of that, these natural linkages, why are they so vital to our environment and the animals that inhabit it as well?
The linkages are, as I was kind of alluding to, us finally recognizing how nature functions at a basic level. I think if you're a farmer or someone who works with animals, you understand that after a while, if you have a herd of cattle or sheep or anything, you have to cycle individuals in and out of that herd. So biodiversity is really the exchange of genetic material. It's the romance of the animals. And if you have moose that are stuck in Larose Forest, the moose do a great job in Larose Forest. They've got lots of habitat. But after a while, some of those moose need to move out of that community, go down to Alfred Bog, and recognizing at a human level that these corridors are needed, that they're important, they should be restored and reforested so that animals can move. It's just us recognizing what animals naturally need to survive. Biodiversity is huge. It's there's a lot of people recognizing the importance of a resilient landscape as we see climate change and other things, kind of putting pressure on our environment. If animals are not able to move, plants also will not be able to move. And these populations will stagnate, and essentially they can become knocked out by one virus, obviously we're learning a lot about that right now.
Yeah, I was going to say that's very topical for what we've been going through at the moment, indeed.
Yeah, and actually you see a lot of people trying to get out and be in these natural spaces too, right? And we have roads to get there when we need to get there, but the animals kind of need the same thing. And if we don't recognize that in our planning policies, then as we develop, we start to encroach more and more on these spaces. The study is not to impose any restrictions on people. It's more to make people aware at this point, to say that it's important to acknowledge it, and hopefully to see some action from private landowners in terms of trying to put more trees on the ground, especially around watercourses and whatnot. So at this point, it's really about education and communication, but it is being formally put into these planning documents to say this is something that is important, we recognize it. So.
And you touched on it in a little bit with the Embrun example and the idea of following the river. How are these natural linkages selected? Because there is a ton of space. How do you bring it down to a tighter corridor, as you were saying? And is it worth bringing it down to a tighter corridor? Is it not better potentially to leave a wider area to maybe stop some construction on that area?
So the way we did it was actually a lot of heavy lifting at the beginning. We took the entire, if you can imagine, like on Google Maps, when you look at that aerial photography, we took the entire landscape and we scored it. And each type of land use received a different score, reflecting how easy or difficult it would be to cross. So it's very coarse level. You don't have to get too in depth, but basically, if it's a natural forest, it would be easy to score. So it would have easy to cross, so it would have a lower score. If it was the 417 highway, it would have a higher score because it would be a barrier. And then you run an analysis that's almost equivalent to running like water down a hill. Water will always find the easiest path. You've essentially created a landscape that's either difficult or easy, and then you run it as if it were a moose crossing. You run it through that landscape, and that model finds the easiest path. Then you use your common sense, kind of what you were getting at, to take a look at it. And we did actually make the corridors slightly larger where they go through natural cover already, and especially if that was publicly owned, part of a floodplain, zoned restrictively. But if it did go through a town, a place like an aggregate operation, we narrowed it in because we recognize that there's a balance on the landscape. We need areas to develop. We need areas to obtain stone and gravel, and we also need farmland. So we tried to be practical with it and make sure that it actually reflected areas that could be reforested or were potentially able to be naturalized. And if we had more than one option, we would choose the best one. So yeah.
And you touched on it a little bit earlier as well, and these maps that have been created with the corridors and the natural linkages areas on them, how are they going to be utilised in a practical sense? As you said, that there's some areas that still need to be used to collect stone, the timber is still going to be needed, all for the economy. So how are these going to be utilised in a practical sense, these maps that you've created?
So the first, and I think the biggest thing right now, is just bringing the awareness. It's actually putting on paper, recognizing that natural heritage systems are an inherent way we have to manage natural resources. The actual corridors themselves will not have any additional protection or restrictions on them. Something like agriculture is never going to be restricted by these types of corridors. Where they'll see an average person would encounter this in a way of like bumping up against a rule or something like that would be if you were going to do a development activity. You had a piece of land, let's say it was near Larose Forest, and you were looking to do a subdivision, whatever, you know, a water park, all kinds of things, that cool things that come through the door. This area would have already had a lot of protection through the significant woodland here, any areas of natural scientific interest. But now, since it's recognized as this regional national natural core, it's also kind of got that elevated status to say, this is an area that we intend to remain natural. We don't want to see impacts on this area. So are we able to shift this development away, maybe 50 meters? Can we avoid impact by keeping this to this side of the lot? You know, a lot of what we do, especially in Eastern Ontario, is take an approach to work with people. We kind of say, yeah, we've done scientific research, we've mapped this, we recognize it's important. It's important to the community. How do we work together to get this water park or whatever on the ground, but also make sure that this important feature is not impacted?
So as you say, it's about protecting the environment and the animals that utilize the environment, but you're not there to completely oppose against what the economical development or the human development. So what kind of changes are you hoping, because was all of this put on, was it on public land or was it on private? And so what happens with the private land? And are you hoping that any changes are put in place by, well, A, municipalities and B, private landowners?
So if it's on private land, there's no obligation for people to do anything to restore or protect the natural heritage linkage, let's say, or corridor. But I hope what's going to happen, and we're already seeing it, the project's not even done, is more money being given to folks who'd like to do something on their property if they're in these areas. So focusing on an incentive basis rather than, there's a lot of talk of like carrots and sticks all the time, right? We're already applying for grants to do more restoration within the corridor, so offer tree planting programs to people. We've done edible buffers, which are where you plant fruit trees and nut trees all along watercourses for people, depending on what they're looking for. And we're looking for farmers. There's always farmers approaching us for clean water grants and other types of environmental grants. So we would prioritize. You'd essentially be at the front of the line if you were willing and interested to do something. Same with development. If you've got a large parcel to develop and you know you've got this core area you want to protect, you know, we're going to help, we're going to work with you to make sure that's protected. And maybe we can find some grants to help you. You know, there is a business in Hammond that they're looking to develop some recreational cabins, you know, there's a brewery, there's a golf course, and they'd like to do some eco cabins. We're going to work with them, you know, stay a little bit away from this, but let's see if we can get some grants to help promote your business, keep the economic development going, and work together. It really comes down to working together.
Yes.
But the first step is giving people the maps, the information, like showing them what it looks like on the ground and saying, and that's what the consultation is for, say, can we agree that these areas are important to us and that they have value? And then we decide as a community and as council is what we want to do with that information.
One of the graphics you'd shown throughout the two presentations that you did last week was touching on this whole infrastructure and the way in which we all work together, very much pushing home the point you just made. So there was a river on it, and it was the way in which if we build in a certain way with the farm here and the town here and the road there, then we have problems, but if we do it this way, it works. So talk to us a little bit more about the importance of being able to work together, but in a way that really benefits people.
I think I've been working in planning for a few years now, and one thing I've learned is that it builds a stronger community. It builds value in terms of housing value and tax assessment when you have natural spaces nearby in any type of development. So a lot of people will come in and they'll want to sort of have sort of a blank slate, right? And I understand the ease when it comes to engineering and whatnot to do that. But there's a lot more value in working together with the county, with the municipality, with the developer, with the conservation authority to find a situation where everyone wins. Like if you have a beautiful valley land, and there's some beautiful valleys here in Larose Forest, absolutely gorgeous, and you want to do an eco cabin retreat, for example, I mean, if you want to have a nice passive recreational trail down by the valley, that's fantastic, and I think people are going to love that. If you want to put a cabin right by the valley where you also have slope stability issues and erosion and potentially not a safe environment for development. It's just not going to work for so many reasons. So when you try to fight against all of this stuff, it's difficult. But when we work together and we say these things are important to us, we'll find a way to make it work. Everyone wins, and it really reflects in the community value that everyone sees. So.
And I know you've touched on it a lot, and it's a little bit obvious at this point, but I take it this recent study and survey and the steps moving forward, South Nation conservation, you're not looking at stopping residential and economical and business growth in certain areas. It's just figuring out the best way to do it. As you said, if you want one of these kind of glamping cabins, you do want that to be in an area that could probably be a core natural area, because that's the whole appeal to it, isn't it? So how do you strike that balance?
It's hard. I mean, it's kind of like no one likes to be in gray areas, right? A lot of people like black and white. But the reality is there's a lot of times where things like that could work, where a passive kind of camping recreational use could fit in areas, especially if they're not sensitive. What we usually require people to do is an environmental impact study. That's within the county's right to ask for that anytime they're near a large area like this, a forest, a woodland, a watercourse. And that is kind of two professionals, a biologist at the applicant side and a biologist at the Conservation Authority side. And they get together and kind of work out where would it be possible to do what you want to do without impacting anything. They look for species at risk, they propose mitigation. It's kind of the document that everyone works towards agreeing on. And there are areas you cannot build, and those have existed in the province for, since 2006. There's been provincially significant wetlands. But what we were trying to tell people is that nothing's changed. If you had an area like that you were not able to develop, that's been like that for a long time. You've been aware.
Area, there's no changes there.
Yeah, okay. Exactly. So, yeah.
And in terms of, there's a ton of obviously flat and agricultural land in the area, whether it's being utilised for agriculture or not. There's a ton of it. So how does this study and this survey impact these lands and the future of the agricultural industry in the local area?
Yeah, so I think I was mentioning it before, but the agricultural community is not impacted by the natural heritage system. When we actually set out to lay out the framework for the mapping, we worked with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture's previous comments. So we consider agriculture to be an important partner, not a barrier, an obstacle to environmental work. And we work very closely with a lot of the big agricultural producers in the area. We've had agricultural forest cover committees. This study kind of came as a result of working with the agricultural community and understanding that generally many of them are very good stewards of the land. And many of them want to do what they can to protect clean water, to protect the soil, and to protect even the forest. The difficulty is we have good farmland here. This is an area where we have very good farmland, but we also have the need for natural spaces, both for people and for animals. So finding that balance requires difficult conversations, getting together with people and actually hearing from them about their concerns. And it also requires us to take this incentive-based approach and really put our trust in the community to say, if you have one of these areas that are so important for the region, would you consider a tree planting program along that stream? Especially if it's going to be paid at reduced cost and the work done for you. We have had good success with that. We're planting, I think it's 200,000 trees next year on private land. So there's a good history of stewardship in the area, and I hope it continues, and I hope we can, with this project, achieve even more and really let people know where it's most important that they focus on these kinds of things.
So the onus is very much on the municipalities to be able to look at these kind of surveys and systems and be able to adapt their own laws around it, their own bylaws around it, and to be able to usher their communities in the right way as well, because obviously councillors are elected to represent their communities. You touched on the tree planting program, which has been a phenomenal success for SNC over the last few years, and great to hear that it's going to be persevering and powering on this year as well. But how important is not only tree planting, but as well the cutting down of trees in a very economical way, but also environmentally friendly way? Because cutting down trees isn't always a bad thing, is it?
No, definitely not. We own about 13,000 acres of land at South Nation, and we do forest harvest on our own property. Larose Forest here is part of a sustainable forestry plan. There's a lot of literature out there, I suppose, from forest stewardships. You know, there's ways to do it. Clear cutting is obviously the most impactful to the landscape. And there's not many situations where clear cutting is going to make a lot of sense. Even agriculturally, it can be very difficult to sort of work that land after. I think it's nice when you see a place like Larose where they can bring in like $500,000 in revenue sustainably while still offering space for the public to walk and the animals to live. So cutting trees for firewood, cutting dead trees on your property, cutting trees for recreational trails, like all of that can exist in harmony with the environment.
And in looking towards the future now, what's the immediate impacts and ramifications that you're hoping the study will provide? And obviously, what are SNC's big plans for 2021?
So that's a great question. The study is wrapping up public engagement next week. So people have an opportunity to go onto the website, fill out the engagement forms, and even book a one-on-one meeting with us if they're interested. We'll then take all of that information, finalize our maps, and prepare them for both counties to receive. And the counties plan to update their official plans in the next year or so. So United Counties of Prescott and Russell will be updating theirs early next year. So there's going to be more public meetings and open houses. So we still have time to have conversations with people, which is nice. But I think from what we've heard so far that people are pretty happy with the mapping. They understand it. And they want to have basically more conversations about how they can help and how we could have more beautiful conservation areas like this one. And for South Nation, we have a big tree planting push coming up in the spring. We'll be planting about 200,000 trees. We do that every year, but obviously with coronavirus, it's not getting easier. So we're just organizing that. We're going to be doing some floodplain mapping. We're going to be looking at putting more hazard maps together to protect people from floods, especially along the Ottawa River, where obviously there's been many people impacted up there. And yeah, generally we're just seeing a lot of development, seeing a lot of residential development in the area, big housing boom and whatnot. So working on planning, regulations, and permitting, and hoping to work with people on their properties to plant more trees and protect some of the natural heritage systems that we talked about. And hopefully people embrace the project and really run with it.
Well, I'm sure we'll catch up about all of these things as the year goes on as well. Great to have this initial talk with you. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us. And let's just hope that this survey, this study, and the impact that it can have is create more paths for moose, just like Alice, to be able to continue their journeys upward.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Alison.
Thank you.
Cheers.